The wedding hall in Seoul had never been so silent. 200 guests watched Han Do-jin sit motionless in his wheelchair at the altar, and no one breathed. The photographer lifted his camera and asked, gently, for a smile. Do-jin's jaw tightened. 3 years since a bullet stole his legs, and no man had seen the boss smile once. His uncle, Han Sung-ho, smirked from the front row, certain the foreign bride would flee before the vows. Becky Coker stood beside the wheelchair in a borrowed dress, a London girl marooned among cold strangers, who openly despised her, her hands trembling. "Smile," the photographer pleaded again. Do-jin stared ahead, cold as stone. Then Becky leaned down and brought her lips to his ear, whispering 8 quiet, careful words no one else could hear. The boss went still, and slowly, impossibly, the corner of his mouth lifted. The room gasped. Sung-ho's smirk died. Becky straightened, terrified of what she had started, because she alone knew a secret that could burn this whole house to the ground. Welcome to your favorite place for Afro-Korean stories. Besties, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from and what time it is over there. If you're here for romance, powerful mafia bosses, and unforgettable plot twists, I have something just for you. My Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection gives you 15 stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories available only through the collection. Simply click the link in the description, or if you're watching on a TV, pause the video and open your phone's camera and point it at the QR code on your screen. It takes just seconds. Now let's go back to how a girl from London ended up standing at that altar. 6 months earlier, Becky Coker had knelt in a small chapel in South London and watched them lower her mother into the ground on a gray Tuesday that could not be bothered to rain properly. It drizzled. Everything about that morning was half-hearted, as if even the weather had decided her family was not worth a real storm. She was 31 years old, and she had spent the last of her savings on a coffin, and when the funeral director handed her the bill with an apologetic little cough, she understood that grief was not the end of it. Grief was only the doorway. Behind her mother's death came the debt, an avalanche of it. Letters her mother had hidden in a biscuit tin at the back of the cupboard. Loans taken quietly against a house already mortgaged twice over. Favors owed to men who did not send flowers and would not accept sorrow as payment. Becky had a plan for the debt, and the plan had a name, and the name was David. David, who had put a ring on her finger the previous spring and promised her a wedding in the autumn. David, who held her hand at the graveside and told her, in front of everyone, that they would face it together, whatever it took. David, who, precisely 11 days later, sat across from her in a cafe near the station and explained, stirring a cappuccino he did not drink, that he simply could not begin a marriage buried under someone else's mistakes. He said it kindly. That was the part she could never forgive. How kind he was about it. How gentle. How reasonable. He even left a 10-pound note on the table for her tea, as though a man could purchase his way out of a promise for the price of a pot of Earl Grey. She did not touch the money. She left it there when she walked out, and she did not cry until she had turned the corner where he could not see. So she was alone, and she was 31, and she was drowning. And this is the thing you must understand about Becky Coker if you are going to understand anything at all. She did not break. She went home to the empty flat. She made herself a cup of tea with the milk that was nearly turning, and she laughed. Not because anything was funny. She laughed because the alternative was to lie down on the kitchen floor and never get up. And Becky had buried too many people in her life to give the floor that satisfaction. Her mother used to say that a woman who can still laugh at the bottom of the well has already found the rope. Becky did not know yet how far she would have to climb, or that the rope, when it came, would be tied to the wrist of a man who could not walk. She had a business degree, gathering dust in a drawer, and 11 years of caring for a sick mother instead of building the career it promised. She had references that said she was reliable and warm and did not complain. She had, when she added it all up on the back of the debt letter one sleepless night, 140 pounds and a passport. The men her mother owed had begun to telephone. One of them, on the third call, told her softly that he knew where she worked, and that was the night she started reading the overseas advertisements. The one that decided her was tucked between a listing for dog walkers and a scheme that was almost certainly a pyramid. Live-in domestic position, overseas placement, excellent salary, accommodation provided, discretion essential, Seoul, South Korea. She read it 3 times. Discretion essential was the phrase that decided her, because discretion essential meant nobody would ask why a woman with a business degree was scrubbing floors on the other side of the planet, and nobody asking questions sounded just then like the most beautiful thing in the world. She would send money home to hold the debt collectors off her mother's memory. She would disappear into a country where no one knew that David had left, or that the house was gone, or that Becky Coker had ever had further to fall from. What she did not know, filling out the form in that cold flat with her turning milk going gray in the cup, was that the household she had just applied to had gone through 11 housekeepers in 3 years, that the last one had left in the middle of the night without collecting her wages, and that the reason had nothing whatsoever to do with the work. The flight to Incheon took 11 hours, and Becky spent most of it awake, watching the little plane on the seatback screen crawl across a map of countries she had never seen and could not have named a fact about. She landed into a wall of August heat, and a language that moved past her like water, and a driver holding a sign with her name spelled slightly wrong. Coke, the R lost somewhere between 2 alphabets. He did not smile. He did not speak beyond her name. He took her single suitcase, loaded it into a black car with windows so dark she could not see out of them, and drove her 90 minutes through a Seoul that glittered and towered and blazed with light, and then, gradually, thinned into high walls and older money and the kind of silence that costs a very great deal to maintain. The house, she would learn very quickly not to call it a house, sat behind a gate that opened by itself before the car had even slowed. It was all clean gray stone and glass, and long, low lines. Beautiful, the way a blade is beautiful, and it made her feel, the moment she stepped out of the car into the heavy heat, that she had made a terrible mistake. Men stood at intervals along the drive, not gardeners. They wore dark suits in the wet August air, and did not sweat, and watched her with the flat, patient attention of people whose profession was cataloging threats. One of them murmured something into his cuff as she passed, and she caught only the tone of it, the small dismissal, the, "It's only a woman, only the new one." An older woman met her at the door, severe and neat, her gray hair pinned so tightly it looked painful to wear. This was Mrs. Bay, the head of household staff, and she looked Becky up and down with an expression suggesting the agency had, once again, failed to send anything of use. "You are the new one," Mrs. Bay said in careful, accented English. It was not a question. "You will last 2 weeks. They always say 2 weeks. She turned on her heel. "Come, and do not touch anything you are not told to touch. This is not a house where curiosity is survived." Becky followed her through rooms that swallowed sound, past a wall of glass that looked out over a garden raked into patterns, past a staircase that curved up into shadow, and somewhere in the 3rd or 4th of those enormous, echoing rooms, she made a decision that would change everything. though at the time, it looked like nothing at all. She decided to be kind anyway. She did not know these people. She did not know what she had walked into, but she had learned at the bottom of her own well that kindness costs nothing and confuses your enemies more thoroughly than cleverness ever could. And so when a young maid dropped a tall stack of pressed linens in the corridor ahead of them and froze in absolute terror, staring at Mrs. Bay's back like a rabbit that has heard the hawk, Becky knelt without a word and helped her gather them. "It's all right," she said, in the few phrases of Korean she had drilled into herself on the plane, mangling the tones so badly the girl almost forgot to be afraid. "I'm clumsy too. Worse than you. You should see me with a full teapot." The girl, her name was Sun Hee, and she was 19 and had been at the house 4 months and had not been spoken to gently in all 4 of them, stared at Becky as though a lion had knelt down beside her and offered to share its lunch. Mrs. Bay, ahead of them, stopped. She did not turn around. But she waited, which was its own kind of statement, until the linens were gathered and the girl had fled, and then she walked on, and said nothing at all. And that silence, Becky would understand much later, was the first door in that house that did not slam in her face. Nobody thanked her. But that evening, a small covered bowl of extra rice appeared outside her door, left by no one, explained by no one. And Becky sat on the narrow bed in her narrow room and ate it slowly, and understood that she had been seen, and that in a house like this one, to be seen was a rare and dangerous kindness. She met the master of the house on the 3rd day, and she met him by breaking a rule. The rule was simple, and she had been given it twice. The East Wing was his. No staff entered the East Wing except Mrs. Bay and the master's personal attendant, a silent giant of a man named Jong Ho, who could have been 40 or could have been 60, and who wore, always, a look of tremendous and private sorrow, like a man attending a funeral that had not yet happened. Becky had nodded both times, she was told. But on the morning of the 3rd day, a summer storm rolled in off the mountains, sudden and enormous. The real storm, her mother's funeral, had been denied. Thunder that shook the great glass panes in their frames, rain coming down in ropes. And in the middle of it, the power in the house flickered, buzzed, and died. The whole gray mansion went dark and silent as a held breath. And into that silence, from somewhere down the forbidden east corridor, came the sound of something heavy falling, and then a man's voice, low and furious, and, underneath the fury, unmistakably afraid. She did not think. That was her gift, and it was her curse. In the one moment that mattered, she never stopped to think. She simply moved. She took a candle and a box of matches from the kitchen drawer she had already, in 3 days, mapped completely, and she went toward the sound, down the hall she was forbidden to enter, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, and she pushed open a heavy door onto a room where a man had fallen from his wheelchair to the floor and could not, for all his terrible strength, get himself back up. He was perhaps 35. Even sprawled and helpless in the shaking candlelight, he was carved out of something harder than the men outside. Black hair fallen across his brow, a jaw like a closed and bolted door, a white shirt come loose at the collar, and a fury in his frame that had nothing to do with the fall and everything to do with the witness. His eyes found her in the doorway and filled instantly, not with relief, not with gratitude, but with rage. Rage at being seen. She would understand later that this was the deepest wound the bullet had left, deeper than the spine, that a man built entirely to be feared could be discovered on the floor of a dark room by a foreign housemaid with a candle, and could do nothing, nothing at all, to stop her looking. "Get out," Han Do-jin said. His English was quiet and precise. and it cut like something kept very sharp for the purpose. "Get out of this room. Get out, or I will have you thrown from this house tonight, into that storm, and no one will stop me." Becky set the candle down on the floor, in its own small pool of light, and did not leave. "I'll go in a minute," she said, "after I help you up. Then you can throw me out on your own 2 feet. She heard the words as they left her mouth and shut her eyes. "Oh no, that came out wrong. I'm so sorry. On your own terms. I meant you can throw me out on your own terms." A short, appalled laugh escaped her before she could stop it, the reflex of a woman who has learned to laugh at the bottom of wells. "Please pretend I said the second thing." For one long moment, she was certain he would call the men in the suits, that the last thing she would see of Korea was that dark room and that furious face. Instead, Han Do-jin, who had not been made to laugh in 3 years and had every intention of not being made to laugh now, looked at this foreign woman kneeling on the floor of his private darkness, apologizing for a terrible joke, and something behind his eyes flickered. Not amusement. He would not permit himself amusement, but the ghost of the memory of what amusement had once been. "You are the new housekeeper," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. "I'm Becky. You will not touch me." "Then how exactly am I helping you up? Telepathy? I'm not certified." She was already moving as she said it, crossing the floor on her knees, sliding an arm beneath his, and he was far too proud to fight her off, and far too heavy to refuse the help. And between the two of them, they got him back into the chair, in a graceless, straining, undignified struggle that stripped every last ounce of the boss out of the man, and left, somehow, when it was done, something quieter and more human in its place. He was breathing hard. So was she. For a moment neither of them could look at the other. "No one," he said at last, when he had his breath, "is to know that I fell." "Fell where?" said Becky, sitting back on her heels and brushing the dust from her knees. "I didn't see anything. Terrible eyesight, me. My grandmother's. God rest her. She once mistook the vicar for a coat rack and hung her umbrella on him." She rose, retrieved her candle, and moved to the door. "Good night, boss. Mind the floor. It's out to get us both." And she left him there in the dark. And Han Do-jin sat alone in his silent room with the thunder rolling away over the mountains, and discovered, to his own great inconvenience, that his heart was beating in a rhythm he had almost completely forgotten how to feel. Becky did not know what a bullet had done to that man's spine. She did not know that he ran one of the oldest criminal organizations in the city of Seoul, that the men in the dark suits along the drive were killers, that the beautiful cold house had been paid for in ways she would never want described to her. She knew only that a proud and frightened man had fallen in the dark, and that she had helped him up and made a fool of herself doing it, and that this small ridiculous thing was, in her whole disastrous year, the first thing she had done that felt as though it mattered. Over the days that followed, the house changed around her by degrees so small that no one inside it could have said when the change began. Sun-hee started leaving flowers, weeds really, pulled from the edge of the raked garden, in a water glass in the kitchen where Becky would find them. The silent giant Jong-ho, who spoke to no one, began to nod to her in the corridor, a single grave inclination of his enormous head. Even Mrs. Bay, one evening, watching Becky hum tunelessly over a sink of dishes, said without turning around, "You sing badly." And then, after a pause that lasted the length of 3 plates, "But the kitchen is warmer than it has been in 3 years. Do not let it go to your head." From Mrs. Bay, Becky was learning that was very nearly a love letter. And Do-jin began, without ever admitting it to himself, to listen for her. He heard her before he saw her. Always, She moved through his silent house trailing sound, the way other people trailed perfume, humming, murmuring to the plants, laughing to herself at some joke she never shared. He told himself it was an irritation. He told himself he would speak to Mrs. Bay about the noise. He did not speak to Mrs. Bay about the noise. And on the 14th day, when he did not hear her all morning because she had been sent into the city on an errand, he found the silence of his own house, the silence he had built and paid for and demanded, suddenly and unbearably loud. It was that same 14th day, long past the 2 weeks the whole household had wagered she would never survive, that Becky heard the conversation she was never meant to hear. She was returning a tea tray to the kitchen through the covered walkway that ran along the outside of the main study, and the study window had been cracked open against the lingering heat, and a voice she did not recognize was speaking inside, low and smooth and entirely certain of itself. It was the voice of a man who had never once been told no, and had stopped expecting to hear it. She did not yet know the face that belonged to it. She knew only that the voice made her feet stop moving on the boards, because of what it was calmly saying. A cripple cannot lead. The old families are already whispering it in rooms he is not invited to. 3 years, and he has not taken a single step, has not fathered an heir, has not shown his face at the council in 8 months. How long do you truly imagine they will go on kneeling to a boss who cannot stand to receive them? A pause. The soft clink of a heavy glass set down on wood. The vote is coming. When it comes, the seat is mine. The families will see sense. And if the boy should make it difficult for us, and here the voice grew softer, which was a great deal worse than if it had grown louder, then we do it the other, quieter way. He is a sick man, after all. Everyone knows he is a sick man. Sick men die in their sleep every night of the world, and no one thinks to look twice at a sick man who does not wake. Becky stood frozen in the covered walkway with a tea tray in her 2 hands, and her heart slamming so hard against her ribs she was certain it could be heard through the open window, and she understood, all at once and far too completely, exactly what kind of house she had crossed the entire world to work in, and exactly what kind of danger the man she had helped up off the floor was truly in. And that was the moment the old floorboard beneath her right foot chose to betray her, with a single small catastrophic creak. Inside the study, the voice stopped. Footsteps crossed the room, unhurried, which was worse than if they had rushed. The door onto the walkway swung open, and a man stepped out into the afternoon light, silver at the temples, expensively and beautifully dressed, a smile already arranged upon a face that had perhaps never once meant one in its life. Han Sung-ho, the master's uncle, looked at the African woman standing rigid beside his nephew's study with a tea tray trembling in her hands, and he understood, exactly as completely and as instantly as she had, precisely how much she had heard. "Ah," he said, pleasantly, and drew the door shut behind him, so that the two of them stood quite alone in the narrow walkway with the raked garden beyond. "The famous new girl, the one who lasted. They did wager against you downstairs, you know. I believe Mrs. Bay is out 3 months' tips." He took a slow, considering step toward her, and then another, until she could smell his cologne, and, beneath it, the whiskey. "You have kind eyes. It is remarkable. My nephew's staff never have kind eyes. He collects hard people, as hard as himself. But you," the smile widened, and reached nothing at all, went nowhere near the flat attention of his gaze. "You never learned to hide your face, did you? It is all sitting right there. Everything you just heard. I can read it as plainly as a signpost." Becky did not move. Every instinct that her difficult, careful, much-buried life had ever given her was screaming the same single word. "So here is precisely how it is going to be," Sung-ho said, softer still, leaning in until his voice was a thing meant for her ear alone. A caress, laid over the edge of a blade. "There are only two ways that this ends for you, girl, and you are going to want to choose between them very, very carefully. The first way," Sung-ho explained, "was that Becky forgot everything she had heard, forgot the vote, forgot the council, forgot the soft and reasonable talk of sick men who do not wake. She would continue as a housekeeper, she would keep her kind eyes lowered, and in a few months, when the seat had quietly changed hands, she would be given a generous sum of money and a plane ticket and the warm recommendation of the new head of the family, and she would go home to London a wealthier and a wiser woman." "You seem practical," he said. "Practical women live long lives." The second way he did not describe. He only let the silence sit where the description should have been, and watched her face while it sat there, and smiled his smile that reached nothing. "I don't understand," Becky said, and she made her voice small and confused, because she had learned in a hard school that a frightened woman is underestimated, and an underestimated woman is safe. "I was only bringing the tray. I don't even have the Korean to follow what you gentlemen were discussing. Business, I think?" "I heard business." She let her hands tremble, which was not difficult, and did not have to be faked. "I'll keep out of your way, sir. I always keep out of the way." For a long moment, Sung-ho studied her, and she could not tell whether he believed the performance or merely enjoyed it. Then he stepped back, and the walkway felt enormous again, and he adjusted the cuff of his beautiful jacket. "Good," he said. "Practical. Go and put your tray away, girl, and do give my regards to my nephew. Tell him his uncle worries for his health." He turned and walked back into the study, and did not look at her again. And Becky carried the tray to the kitchen on legs that did not feel like her own, and set it down and gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles went pale, and made a decision that any practical woman would have known was madness. She was going to warn him. She turned the problem over all through that long afternoon while she worked. She owed Han Do-jin nothing. She had known the man 2 weeks. She was now fairly certain, a criminal, and not a small one. The men in the suits, the gate that opened by itself, the whole cold apparatus of fear made sense now in a way it had not before. And the sensible, the practical thing was to take Sung-ho's first road, take the money, go home, and let these dangerous men do to each other whatever dangerous men did. She thought of the debt collectors telephoning her mother's memory. She thought of the 10-pound note David had left on the cafe table. She thought of every single time in her life she had been useful to someone, until the moment she stopped being useful, and been discarded the instant the use ran out. And then she thought of a proud man on a dark floor, snapping "get out" to hide how frightened he was, and she knew she was not going to be practical, because being practical had never once saved her, and being kind, at least, let her sleep. She found him that night on the terrace, alone, as he almost always was, looking out over the black shapes of the mountains, with a glass of something untouched at his elbow. Jang-ho stood a discreet distance off in the shadows, and, at a look from Becky, melted further into them. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, without preamble, because she had decided that if she was going to be foolish, she would at least be quick about it. "And then you can throw me out of the house, and this time I won't even make the joke." He did not turn his head. "You are the only person in this house who speaks to me as though I might bite. Everyone else speaks to me as though I already have." A pause. "Say you're something." So she said it. All of it. The cracked window, the smooth, certain voice, the vote, the council, the old family's whispering. And then, because she would not soften a thing that might save his life, the soft and reasonable talk of sick men who die in their sleep, and the two ways it could end for her, and the money, and the ticket. She watched his profile the whole time she spoke, and his profile did not change, not once. And when she had finished, he was quiet for so long that she began to believe he had not heard, or did not care, or had known all of it already, and found her warning tedious. "Why?" Han Do-jin said finally, still watching the mountains. "Would you tell me this? Because he was going to have you killed, and let everyone think you'd just stopped waking up, and nobody was going to warn you, and I couldn't be the person who knew and said nothing." She lifted one shoulder. "That's the whole reason. It's not a clever reason. I don't have a clever one." He turned the chair, then to look at her fully, and in the light spilling from the house his face had lost some of its granite. "Do you understand," he said slowly, "that by telling me this, you have made an enemy of the second most dangerous man in this city? That the first road he offered you, the money, the ticket, is closed to you now, forever, the moment he learns you came to me? Do you understand what you have done?" Becky considered this. "I understand," she said, "that I've done the right thing and probably the stupid thing at the same time. In my experience, they're usually the same thing wearing different coats." She almost smiled. "I'm very consistent." And Han Do-jin looked at this woman who had crossed the whole world with a single suitcase, who had knelt on his floor and made a terrible joke, who had just knowingly thrown away her own safe passage home to warn a criminal she had known for a fortnight, and for the first time in 3 years he felt something in his chest that was not rage and was not grief and was not the cold machinery of survival. He did not have a name for it yet. He would not let himself go looking for the name. "Sit down," he said. "You are about to be very useful to me, and I dislike bargaining with people who are standing." That word, useful, landed on Becky's oldest bruise, and she felt it land, and she sat down anyway, because she was learning that this man used hard words the way other men used armor, to be struck first and struck loudest, and that underneath the armor there might be something worth the bruise. What he proposed over the next hour on that dark terrace was a marriage. It was, he explained with the flat precision of a man reading terms off a page, entirely a matter of strategy, and she was not to mistake it for anything else. Sung-ho's whole case against him rested on 2 claims: that a paralyzed man could not lead, and that a man with no wife and no heir had no future to lead into. The first claim Do-jin could not disprove. The legs were gone and would not be argued back. But the second he could demolish overnight. A boss with a wife was a boss with a household, a lineage, a stake in tomorrow. The old families understood marriages. They had been arranged and traded and weaponized among these families for 200 years. A sudden bride would buy him time, and time was the only thing he needed, because Do-jin was closer than his uncle knew, to finding out who had truly ordered the ambush that put him in the chair. And when he had that name, the vote and the council and Sung-ho's whole patient scheme would collapse like a house made of paper. "And I need the wife to be someone he cannot touch," Do-jin said. "Someone outside every family, every debt, every old alliance he could pull. Someone who owes him nothing and fears him nothing." He looked at her. "Someone who has already made herself his enemy for no profit at all. You are Becky Coker, the single most inconvenient thing that has walked into this house in 3 years. Marry me, and you become family. Family cannot be quietly dismissed. Family cannot be paid off and put on a plane. Family in this world is the one thing even Sung-ho must think twice before he touches." "And what do I get?" said Becky, "besides a very dangerous new surname? Protection. Money. Real money. Not the pittance the agency pays you. Enough to bury whatever it is in London you keep not talking about." He had noticed, then. She said nothing. "And when it is done, when I have my name and my uncle is finished, you walk away, clean, wealthy, and no longer anyone's employee. A marriage on paper, nothing more. I am not." And here, for the only time, the precise voice caught, almost imperceptibly, "I am not in a position to offer anything more. As you can plainly see, it is a transaction. I want you to understand that it is only a transaction." And Becky, sitting in the dark beside a man who had just told her, in the same breath, that she was inconvenient and that he needed her, and that she must never mistake being needed for being wanted, felt the old bruise throb, and heard herself say yes anyway. Because the money would save her mother's name. Because the man was in danger and she was, God help her, already in it beside him. And because a transaction, nothing more, was a lie, and she could hear that it was a lie, and she suspected he could hear it too. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The wedding was arranged in 11 days. It was not, whatever the guests believed, a love match. And it was not, whatever Sung-ho suspected, a clumsy trick. It was a fortress, built fast, and everyone who came to the great hall in Seoul came to inspect the walls. The old family sent representatives with cold eyes and warm words. The rival factions sent watchers. And Sung-ho sat in the front row in a beautiful dark suit and smiled his smile that reached nothing, because he had understood the move the instant it was made, and he had come to see whether the foreign bride would hold her nerve, or whether she would crack in front of 200 witnesses and hand him back the advantage. She did not crack. She stood beside the wheelchair in a borrowed white dress among strangers who despised her. And when the photographer asked the boss to smile, and the boss could not, and the whole enormous room began to curdle with the failure of it, the murmurs starting, "You see, there is nothing there. There is no marriage. There is no future. The man is already a corpse who has not been told." Becky leaned down and put her lips to his ear and whispered 8 quiet, careful words that no one else could hear. And Han Do-jin went still, and slowly, impossibly, in front of 200 people who had come precisely to watch him fail, the corner of his mouth lifted. We began this whole story at that moment. Besties, at that impossible almost smile. And I promised you I would tell you what she whispered. I am keeping the promise. But not yet. Because the 8 words she said into his ear are the same 8 words that unlock everything. And you are going to want to know the whole truth of these 2 before you hear them. Trust me. Stay with me. We are getting there. The room gasped. The murmurs died in 200 throats at once. And in the front row, Han Sung-ho's smile finally, for the first time in Becky's sight of him, slipped. Because a boss who could smile was a boss the old families might yet kneel to, and the fortress the 2 of them had built in 11 days had just, before his eyes, put up its first unbreachable wall. What no one in that hall knew, what Becky herself did not yet fully know, was that the almost smile had not been a performance, that the 8 words had been true, and that the truth inside them was already, quietly, beginning to pull the whole house toward the edge of something none of them could see coming. The marriage, once made, had to be lived, and living it changed things that neither of them had put in the terms. Becky moved out of the narrow servants' room and into a suite in the east wing, across the hall from Do-jin's own, and the household did not know what to do with her. She was the mistress of the house now, technically, and the men in the dark suits did not bow to her, because they did not know whether to, and Mrs. Bay, faced with the impossible arithmetic of a housekeeper who had become a wife, resolved it in the only way her rigid soul allowed. She became, overnight, ferociously protective, as though Becky had been her own project all along. "You will not wear that," she informed Becky on the third morning, of a perfectly ordinary blouse. "You are a Han now. You will look like one. Come." And Becky, who had not been mothered in 11 years, submitted to being dressed and corrected and fussed over, and did not tell Mrs. Bay that she had to leave the room twice to keep from crying about it. She refused, from the first day, to treat Do-jin the way the house treated him. The house treated him like a bomb, everyone tiptoeing, everyone braced. Becky treated him like a man. She barged into his study to tell him the kitchen was out of the tea he liked, and it was his own fault for being particular. She parked his wheelchair in the sun on the terrace and told him he looked like a vampire and needed the vitamins. When he was cold and cutting, and he was often cold and cutting, testing her, always testing, waiting for the day she would tire of it and treat him like glass or like a monster, she gave it straight back to him. "You are impossible," he told her one evening after she had rearranged his entire study to make room for the wheelchair to turn, ignoring 3 direct orders to leave it alone. "I'm efficient," she said, from up a small ladder, hanging a plant he had not asked for. "There's a difference. You'll thank me when you're not bruising your knuckles on that shelf 40 times a day. I've watched you do it. You do it, and then you pretend you meant to. I do not." He stopped. He had, in fact, been doing exactly that for 3 years, and had believed no one had noticed, because no one had ever cared enough to notice. He looked at the woman on the ladder, hanging a plant in his sanctuary against his express command, and felt the thing in his chest again, the thing he still would not name. "You moved my grandfather's sword. I moved your grandfather's sword 8 inches to the left, so you can actually reach the window now. Your grandfather, I'm sure, would rather you had a view than a sword you can't get to." She came down the ladder. "Was he a nice man, your grandfather?" And Han Do-jin, who never spoke of his family, who had buried them all in the same locked room where he kept the memory of walking, found himself telling her, a little and then more, about an old man who had built something terrible and loved his grandson badly and taught him that softness was a wound that others put their fingers into. And Becky listened, sitting on the floor beside his chair as though it were the most natural place in the world to sit, and did not flinch at the terrible parts. And by the end of it, the study was warmer than it had been in 3 years, and neither of them had noticed the night go dark outside the newly reachable window. Before we continue, a quick note for everyone who loves these Mafia Boss romance stories. I've bundled 20 of our most loved Afro-Korean romance stories into the ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get all 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime without ads or interruptions, just click the link below or scan the QR code by pausing the video, opening your phone's camera, and pointing it at your TV or screen. Your next favorite romance could be waiting for you before this story even ends. This became the shape of their days. He would arm himself and she would disarm him, gently, relentlessly, a little more each time. She learned that he had been the youngest man ever to head the organization, that he had taken it at 29 when his father was killed, that he had been, in those first years, hard and brilliant and afraid of nothing, and that the bullet had taken not only his legs, but the belief, bone deep, that he was a man who could protect anyone, since he had not even been able to protect himself. She learned that he did not sleep. She learned that the almost untouched glass at his elbow was always the same glass, poured and never drunk, a habit from before. A ghost of a man who used to be able to relax. She started, without telling him, pouring it out each morning and leaving the empty glass, so that at least the ghost was not staring at him all day. He noticed. He noticed everything. He said nothing, for a week. Then one morning he said, "You have been pouring out my whiskey." "I have been pouring out your whiskey," Becky agreed. "You weren't drinking it. It was just sitting there being sad at you." "I don't like things that sit around being sad. I get rid of them." She looked at him, and something passed between them, quick and warm, and quickly hidden. "It's a policy of mine." "I see," said Jin. And then, so quietly she almost missed it. It was a good policy. And he almost smiled again, the second time in 3 years, and caught himself, and turned it into a scowl, and wheeled himself out onto the terrace before she could see that he hadn't quite managed it. Becky watched him go, and pressed her lips together and thought, there it is again. Whatever it is, it's still in there. And she thought, with a small cold drop of fear beneath the warmth, and I have absolutely no business feeling this way about a married-on-paper criminal who told me plainly that it is only a transaction. None. This is going to end badly, Becky. You know how this ends. It ends the way it always ends. The day he stops needing you. She did not know that across the city, at that same hour, the ending was already being manufactured. Because Han Sung-ho had not survived 40 years in this world by smiling and retreating. The marriage had cost him the easy road, but Sung-ho had never in his life been a man of one road. If the foreign woman could not be quietly removed, then she could be understood. Every person alive had a seam in them, a hidden place, a shame, and a shame in the right hands was a lever, and a lever could move even a fortress. So while Becky hung plants in a dead man's study and poured out a ghost's whiskey and fell, against every instinct she had, a little further each day, Sung-ho hired the best and quietest investigator money could buy in the city of Seoul, and he gave the man a single instruction. Find out who she was before London put her on that plane. Find out what she is hiding. Everyone is hiding something. Bring me hers. The investigator was very good, and very quiet, and it took him 3 weeks. He flew to London. He walked the grey South London streets Becky had fled. He pulled the death certificate of a mother and the mortgage records of a lost house and the sad small paper trail of a debt, and found in all of it nothing that Sung-ho could use. A sad woman. An unlucky woman, but not a woman with a seam. He was nearly ready to report failure. And then, on the last afternoon, in a box of old records at a coroner's office, chasing a loose thread that should have led nowhere, he found something that stopped him cold. He read it twice. He sat back in his chair, and then he made a photograph of it with his telephone, and he booked the next flight to Seoul, because he understood at once that he was no longer holding a lever. He was holding a bomb. Sung-ho was waiting for him in the study, with the cracked window, the same room where all of this had begun, and he did not rise when the investigator entered, only held out one manicured hand for the file. The investigator hesitated, an expensive, professional man, and he hesitated, which Sung-ho had never once seen him do, and then he crossed the room and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, face down, as though he did not want to be the one looking at it when it was read. "Sir," the investigator said quietly, "the girl's brother, the one who died, years ago, before London, the one nobody in her records will name." He wet his lips. "You are going to want to see who he was, and you are going to want to see the date. Sir, you already know the date. You've known it for 3 years." Han Sung-ho turned the paper over, and for the first time in the whole of this story, the smile that reached nothing at all fell entirely off his face. What the paper told him, Han Sung-ho did not share with the investigator. He paid the man, doubled the fee for his silence, and sat alone in the study long after he had gone, turning the single sheet over and over in his hands as though the words on it might rearrange themselves into something he could use more simply. Because he had come looking for a shame, a seam, a lever, and what he had found instead was a truth so large and so dangerous that it could destroy his nephew or destroy Sung-ho himself, depending entirely on who spoke it first, and how, and to whom. The girl's brother had a name, Becky Coker. He had died 3 years ago, in Seoul, on a rainy night in a district Sung-ho knew very well. On the exact night that a young boss named Han Do-jin had been ambushed and shot and left for dead in the street. And the coroner's quiet record, the one nobody in London would ever name, told the rest, that a passing stranger, a young African man in the city for reasons the record did not explain, had pulled a bleeding, dying Han Do-jin out of the line of the second volley, had shielded him with his own body while help was called, and had taken, for his trouble, the bullet that finished the job the ambushers had started. Becky Coker had died in a Seoul gutter, saving the life of a man he had never met, and that man had lived, in a wheelchair, for 3 years, never knowing the name of the stranger who had bought his survival with his own blood. Becky's brother had saved Do-jin's life, and Becky did not know it, and Do-jin did not know it. And now Sung-ho, alone in the dark study, knew it, and understood that he was holding the one piece of information that could either bind those two people together with a bond that no scheme on earth could break, or shatter them so completely that the pieces would never fit again, and that everything now depended on making very sure it did the second thing. Because think, besties, about what this truth does if it lands the wrong way. Do-jin lives because Becky died. Becky's family broke in London, the mother's grief, the debt, the whole slow collapse, because Becky never came home from Seoul. And the man Becky had married, the man she was falling for against every instinct she owned, was the reason her brother was in that gutter. The stranger her brother died for, handled cruelly, at the wrong moment, in the wrong voice. That truth was not a bond. It was a bomb with 2 names carved into it. And Sung-ho, who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to hold a bomb, began, very carefully, to plan. He would not tell them. Telling them was crude, and it risked the bond forming instead of the break. No. He would arrange for them to discover it, at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, with Becky made to look as though she had known all along, as though she had come into this house not by chance, but by design, hunting the man responsible for her brother, and had married him for reasons darker than money. Do-jin, who trusted no one, who had armored himself for 3 years precisely against being deceived, Do-jin would believe it. And the marriage that had built a fortress around his succession would become the thing that finally broke him from the inside, where no bodyguard could stand. But Sung-ho needed time to build it, and while he built it, the thing he most feared began to happen anyway. They fell. It happened slowly and then all at once, the way these things do. It happened over poured-out whiskey and rearranged studies and arguments about tea. It happened the evening Becky found Do-jin awake at 3 in the morning on the terrace, rigid with a pain he never spoke of, the old wound flaring the way it did on cold nights. And she did not ask permission and did not treat him like glass. She simply sat down on the cold stone beside his chair and took his hand and held it and hummed her tuneless London songs until the gray light came up over the mountains and the worst of it passed. Neither of them mentioned it in the morning, but he did not let go of her hand until the sun was fully up, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. It happened the afternoon Sun-hee, the young maid, was cornered in the kitchen by one of Sung-ho's men, sent to frighten and to gather gossip, and Becky walked in on it and put herself between the girl and the man without a half-second's hesitation, chin up, London steel in her spine, and told him in her broken, furious Korean to get out of her kitchen, and the man, astonished, went. And Dojin, told of it that evening by a wide-eyed Sun-hee, looked at his wife across the dinner table and said, "You stood between my staff and one of Sung-ho's men. Do you understand he could have hurt you?" And Becky said, "He was frightening a 19-year-old. What was I supposed to do? Hum louder?" And Dojin was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very low, "No, you were supposed to do exactly what you did. You are the bravest person in this house, and every one of them is armed, and you are not." And something in the way he said it made Becky have to look very hard at her rice. It happened, above all, in the small, unremarkable moments that neither of them would ever be able to point to afterward and say that was when. A shared look across a room full of people who despised them both. The particular quality of his silence when she left and returned, the way she started, without deciding to, thinking of the cold gray mansion as home, the first place in a decade that had felt like one. The way he started, without permitting it, to imagine a version of the future where the marriage did not end on the day his uncle was defeated, where the terms were quietly torn up, where he was allowed to want something for no strategic reason at all. He nearly said it. One night, they were on the terrace. The terrace was theirs now, in the unspoken way that couples divide a house into territories of feeling. And the city glittered below, and Becky was laughing at something. Her whole face opened the way it only ever was with him. And Han Do-jin looked at her, and felt the words rise all the way up into his throat. 3 years of ice breaking at once, and he opened his mouth to say the thing that would tear up every term of their agreement. He opened his mouth to say it, and Jung-ho, the silent giant, appeared in the terrace doorway, with an expression of such controlled alarm that the words died in Dojin's throat unspoken, and the boss became, in an instant, the boss again. There was a situation. There was always, in that house, a situation. Sung-ho had made his move, not the secret one, not yet, but the open one, the one designed to keep Dojin's hands full and his attention away from what was being built in the dark. He had called an emergency session of the council, the old families summoned for the following night, and he had put a single question before them. A vote of confidence in the leadership of Han Do-jin, a boss who in 3 years had not stood, had not been seen, and had now, in his uncle's careful telling, lost his judgment so completely that he had married a foreign servant with no name and no family and no possible value to the organization. A woman, Sung-ho would murmur to each family in turn, that no one had troubled to investigate. A woman who had appeared from nowhere. A woman who might be anyone. A woman who might, for all any of them knew, have been sent. It was clever, and it was cruel, and it turned the fortress of the marriage into a weapon aimed back at the man who had built it. And it meant that Becky and Do-jin, who had very nearly said the unsayable thing to each other on a terrace under the stars, instead spent that night and the whole of the next day fighting side by side, sleeves rolled up, for his survival. Do-jin working every telephone and every old debt and every thread of leverage he had spent 3 years quietly gathering, and Becky at his elbow the entire time, refusing to be sent away, making tea for men who would not thank her, reading his face, catching the moments when the pain flared and covering for him so the men on the calls would not hear the catch in his breath. "You should rest," he told her, near dawn, gray with exhaustion himself. "This is not your fight." "It became my fight," said Becky, "the day I married you. Also, you can't reach the top drawer of that cabinet, and that's where you keep the files you need. So unless you'd like to explain to the council why the boss keeps a stepladder by his desk, I'm staying." She was already climbing it. "Which folder? The green or the blue?" "The green," said Jin, watching his wife on a stepladder at 5 in the morning, fighting to save the life he had nearly ruined by dragging her into it. And he thought, with a clarity that frightened him, "I cannot lose this. Whatever happens with the council, whatever happens with Sung-ho, I cannot lose her. I have lost everything else a man can lose and survived it. I will not survive losing her." He did not say it. There was no time, but he let himself, for one moment, know that it was true. The council session was held the following night in a hall as old and cold as the families it served, and it should have been the end of Jin, and it was not, because he had spent 3 motionless years being underestimated and had learned, in that stillness, to see the whole board at once. Sung-ho rose and made his case, smooth and reasonable and devastating. The paralyzed boss, the vanished leadership, the foreign bride who might be anyone, and the old faces around the table nodded, and the vote seemed to move toward him like water finding its level. And then Jin spoke, from his chair, quietly, and did not defend himself at all. Instead, he laid on the table, one by one, the small, quiet debts and secrets and old loyalties he had gathered in 3 years of being written off as finished. A favor owed by this family, a truth known about that one, a proof, produced at last, that his father's death and his own ambush had been the work of a rival faction that several of the men at this very table had quietly profited from. He did not threaten. He simply let each man understand exactly how much the boss they had all agreed to bury still knew, and could still reach, and would still remember. The vote did not pass. It did not even come to account. One by one, the old families found reasons to reaffirm their loyalty, and Sung-ho stood at the head of a table that had, in the space of 20 minutes, turned entirely back toward the nephew he had come to finish. And he smiled his smile that reached nothing, and he understood that the open road was closed now too, which meant only the secret road was left. And Sung-ho, driving home through the Seoul dark in cold, silent fury, made the decision to detonate the bomb. He would do it now, tonight, before Dojin could consolidate the victory. He would do it in the cruelest possible frame. And he had, he realized, the perfect instrument already in his possession, because among the investigators' findings was a photograph Becky did not know existed. A photograph the investigator had pulled from the coroner's file. A photograph of the rainy Seoul street where Becky Coker had died shielding a stranger. And that same street, that same rain-slicked corner, hung framed on the wall of Jin's own study. The place where he had been shot, the place he kept before him always as a reminder. The photograph Becky had stopped in front of, on her very first night in the house, and stared at with a strange, uneasy, unplaceable sense that she had seen it somewhere before. She had seen it somewhere before. She had seen it in a police report 3 years ago in London, in the worst week of her family's life, when a quiet official had explained to her mother that Becky had died overseas, in the street, in the rain, and had shown them a photograph of the place. Becky had looked at that photograph for 4 seconds in the worst moment of her life, and then never again. But her body remembered. Her body had stopped her cold in the hallway of a stranger's mansion in Seoul, and whispered, "You know this place." And she had not understood why, and she had said nothing, and she had let it go. Sung-ho arranged for her to stop being able to let it go. It was almost elegant, what he did. He did not tell her anything. He simply made sure, through a word to the right servant and a document left in the right place, that on the night of Dojin's victory, the night the two of them should have been celebrating, the night Dojin had finally decided to tear up the terms and tell his wife the truth of his own heart, Becky would find, waiting in her private rooms, a plain envelope, and inside the envelope, the coroner's record, Becky Coker, the date, the street, and the name of the man he had died to save. Becky read it alone, sitting on the edge of the bed in the east wing of the house she had let herself call home. And the whole world she had carefully rebuilt came apart in her hands, one word at a time. Becky, her brother. Her laughing, reckless, beloved older brother, who had gone abroad chasing work 3 years ago and simply never come home, whose death overseas had been the loose thread that unraveled everything. Her mother's grief, the debt, the lost house, David, London, the plane, the agency, the cold gray mansion, all of it. Every catastrophe of her adult life had begun in a Seoul gutter on a rainy night. And her brother had not died in some anonymous accident. He had died throwing his body over a stranger. He had died saving a man. He had died saving this man. The photograph in the study. The place her body had recognized, and her mind had refused. Becky had bled out on that exact corner, buying 3 more years of life for Han Do-jin, for her husband, and no one had ever told her. And she had crossed the entire world and married the man her brother died for without knowing it. And she was in love with him, God forgive her. She was in love with the reason her brother was in the ground. She was still sitting there, the page shaking in her hands, when the door opened, because Dojin had come to find her, come to say the thing he had decided to say, come with his own 3 years of ice finally broken, come to tell his wife that it was not a transaction, and had not been a transaction for a long time. He was smiling. He was almost smiling, the 3rd time in 3 years, and this time he had meant to let it come all the way. And then he saw her face, and he saw the page in her hands, and he crossed the room and took it from her before she could stop him, and he read it. And Han Do-jin learned, in the same 30 seconds, 2 things that no man should learn together. That he was alive because of a stranger's sacrifice he had spent 3 years never able to repay or even name. And that the stranger was his wife's brother. And that his wife was the sister of the man who had died in his place. And that she was sitting on their bed with the proof in her hands, looking up at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, and could not read at all. And into that unreadable silence, every one of his 3 years of armor came slamming back down at once. You knew, he said. It was not a question. It was the oldest fear of a man who trusted no one, arriving at last, wearing the face of the one person he had let inside. You came into this house. You knew whose house it was. You knew what happened on that street. You married me. His voice was very quiet, and it was the voice from the first night on the floor. Get out. The voice of a man who has just discovered he was seen all along. Was any of it real, or did you come here for him? Did you come here for what I owe him? Do-jin. Becky was on her feet, the page falling from her hands. I didn't know. I swear to you on my mother's grave. I didn't. I only just. The photograph. I couldn't remember why I knew the photograph. I would have told you. But he was already turning the chair. Already leaving. Already gone behind 3 years of ice. Because the one thing Han Do-jin could not survive was being deceived by the person he had finally trusted. And Sung-ho had known that, had built the whole trap around exactly that, and it had worked. And Becky stood alone in the beautiful cold room in the house she had let herself call home, holding the proof that her brother had died to save the man she loved, watching that man wheel away from her forever, and understood that she had just lost the only two people who had ever truly mattered to her in the same terrible night, one to a Seoul gutter 3 years ago, and one to a lie she had never even told. The door closed, and for the first time since a rainy Tuesday in a South London chapel, Becky Coker sat down on the floor and did not get up and let the well have her. She did not know how long she sat there. The gray light was coming up over the mountains again when she finally lifted her head, and the tears had dried into something harder and clearer, because Becky Coker had sat at the bottom of wells before, and she knew the one thing the well could never take from her, which was the choice of whether to climb. Her brother had thrown his body over a stranger in the rain. Emeka had died doing the bravest, most reckless, most Emeka thing a man could do, and she had spent one whole night dishonoring it by lying on a floor. He would have laughed at her. He would have hauled her up by the collar and told her that cokers do not drown in sight of the rope. So she got up, she washed her face, and she went to find her husband, not to beg him to believe her, but because there was a truth in this house that had been buried for 3 years, and it was long past time somebody dug it up and held it to the light. But Han Do-jin was not in the house. He had gone, before dawn, to the one place he went when the ice closed over him completely, the rainy corner, the street in the photograph, the place where he had died and not died, where for 3 years he had come alone to sit and remember and hate himself for surviving. And Sung-ho, who had planned this night down to its smallest hinge, had known he would go there, because the trap had never been only the envelope. The envelope was to break the marriage, and a Do-jin with the marriage broken, a Do-jin alone and shattered and stripped of the one person who watched his back, sitting exposed at 4 in the morning on the very corner where he had been shot once already. That was a Do-jin that Sung-ho's men could finish, quietly, at last, and let the world believe that a grieving, betrayed, sick man had simply gone to a sad place and met a sad end. Sick men die every night, and no one looks twice. Becky understood it all at once, standing in his empty study, looking at the space on the wall where the photograph had hung, at the drawer where the coroner's file had come from, at the whole shape of the thing Sung-ho had built. She understood that the envelope had never been about her at all. She had only been the instrument. The target had always been Do-jin, and Do-jin was at this moment exactly where his uncle wanted him, alone, unguarded, and grieving, on the one corner in Seoul where he had already nearly died once. She did not think. In the one moment that mattered, she never did. She took the car. She had watched the drivers enough to manage it, badly, and she drove into a gray Seoul dawn toward a street she had seen twice in her life, once in a police photograph in London, and once on a study wall, and she prayed to a God she had been too angry to speak to since her mother's funeral, that she would not be too late. She was almost too late. She saw the corner first, and then she saw Do-jin's chair, alone under the thinning rain, exactly where her brother had died. And then she saw the two men crossing the empty street toward him, unhurried, professional, the way Sung-ho's men were always unhurried. And she understood in a single ice-cold instant that she was watching the same murder begin a second time, on the same corner, 3 years later, and that this time there was no passing stranger left to throw himself in the way. Except there was her. What Becky Coker did next, she could never afterward fully explain. She did not have Emeka's strength or his speed or his fearlessness. She had a borrowed car, and a voice and a body that had been knocked down more times than she could count, and had learned each time exactly how to get back up. She drove the car up onto the pavement between the two men and the chair, threw the door open, and put herself in the gap, the same gap, the exact gap her brother had filled 3 years before, screaming at the top of her lungs, in English and in broken Korean, that the police were coming, that she had told the council, that a dozen people knew Do-jin was here and knew who had sent them, that if they touched him now, every family in that hall last night would know Sung-ho for a murderer by noon. It was a bluff. She had told no one. There was no time to have told anyone. But she said it with the whole force of a woman who had already lost everything and had discovered, at the bottom of the well, that a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing on any street. And the two men, professionals, calculating, unwilling to gamble their own necks on whether the screaming foreign woman was lying, hesitated. And in a life-and-death matter, besties, hesitation is the whole story. Down the road, real headlights turned the corner. A delivery lorry, nothing more. But its lights swept the street, and the two men made the only professional choice left to them, and melted back into the gray, and were gone. And Becky stood in the gap where her brother had died, shaking, soaked, alive, between two vanishing killers and the man she loved. And she turned around, and Han Do-jin was staring at her from his chair as though he had seen a ghost, because in a sense he had. He had seen it happen once before, on this exact corner, in this exact rain. A stranger, putting a body between him and death, for no reason but that it was the right thing, and the stupid thing, wearing the same coat. He had spent 3 years unable to name the person who had done it, and now he knew the name. It was Coker. It had always been Coker. It had been the brother 3 years ago, and it was the sister now, and it was, he understood at last, the same reckless, impossible, world-crossing courage running in the same blood. And it had just, for the second time, saved his life. "You came for me," he said. His voice was not the voice of ice. "After what I said to you, after I did not believe you, you drove into 2 armed men. For me." "I told you," said Becky, still shaking, rain running down her face or tears. She could no longer tell the difference, and did not care. "I keep doing the right thing, and the stupid thing, at the same time. I'm very consistent." A broken laugh. "My brother was worse than me. He'd have got here faster." And Han Do-jin, sitting in his chair on the corner where he had been broken, looked at the woman standing in the gap his own life had cost her family. And 3 years of ice did not crack. It shattered, all at once, and everything underneath it that he had refused to feel came up into his face at last. And he said, "Becky, come here, please." And she went to him, and he took both her hands, and on that gray corner in the thinning rain, he told her the truth of his heart, that Sung-ho's envelope had interrupted the night before, that it had not been a transaction for a long time, that it had stopped being a transaction the night she sat on cold stone and held his hand until dawn, that he did not want a wife on paper, he wanted her, the impossible humming, plant-hanging, whiskey-pouring bravest person in any house, and that he was sorry, more sorry than his hard mouth knew how to say, for letting 3 years of fear speak in his voice, when it should have been trust. "I owe your brother a debt I can never pay," he said. "He gave me 3 years I did not deserve and did not know what to do with. And then he sent me you. Because I have to believe he sent me you, Becky. I cannot believe a chance this large is only chance. And I nearly threw it away because I was too afraid to be loved. Emeka pulled me out of this gutter once. You pulled me out of it twice." His hands tightened on hers. "Marry me again. Not for the council. Not for a name. For no strategic reason at all. Marry me because I cannot lose you. And I have lost everything else a man can lose. And I know now that this is the only loss I would not survive." And Becky, standing in the rain on the corner where her brother had died, to give this exact moment a chance to exist, understood at last that Emeka's death had not only broken her family, it had, in its own terrible and beautiful arithmetic, built the bridge that carried her across the whole world to this man. And that grieving her brother and loving her husband were not two things at war in her, but one single thread. The same courage, the same blood, the same reckless refusal to let death have the final word. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She had said yes to this man on a dark terrace for all the wrong reasons, and now she said it again in the rain for the only right one. But there was still a man in a beautiful dark suit who had tried to have them both killed, and Han Do-jin had not spent 3 motionless years learning to see the whole board, only to leave the last piece standing. He did not do it with violence, in the end, though violence was available to him and expected of him, and would have been, in that world, entirely understood. He did it the way he had won the council, with the truth, produced at the exact moment it would do the most damage. Because Becky's screamed bluff on the corner had planted a seed, and Do-jin made it real. He took the coroner's file, the same file Sung-ho had weaponized, and he added to it what only he could add. The testimony of the boss himself, at last, 3 years late, naming the corner and the night and the stranger and, crucially, naming the 2 men who had come to finish the job a second time, and the uncle who had sent them. He laid it before the same old families who had so nearly voted him out, and he let them understand exactly what Sung-ho had done, that he had not merely schemed for the seat, which was permitted, which was the old game they all played. He had conspired in the ambush of his own nephew 3 years ago, and had tried to complete the murder a second time this very dawn, and had done it all while sitting at their table calling himself family. That was not the old game. That crossed the one line even these cold men would not forgive, because a man who murders his own blood for a chair is a man who will murder any of them for anything, and no family in that hall could afford to let him stand. Sung-ho understood it was finished the moment he entered the hall and saw their faces, and for once his smile did not even attempt to reach anything at all. He had held a bomb and thought himself the only one who knew how to use it, and he had forgotten the oldest rule of holding a bomb, that the man across from you might simply be willing to let it go off in both your hands. What became of Han Sung-ho was decided by the families in that hall, and it was not merciful, and this is not that kind of story, so we will leave him at the door of that room where the truth finally caught him, and let it close. And now, besties, now I can tell you what she whispered. Come back with me to the wedding hall, months ago, to the almost smile that we began this whole story on. 200 people watching, the photographer begging, the boss frozen, the whole room curdling toward the murmur that would have handed Sung-ho his victory, and Becky leaning down to put her lips to Han Do-jin's ear. She had known him 2 weeks. She did not yet know about her brother, or the corner, or any of it. She only knew that she was standing beside a proud, frightened man in the worst moment of a very public performance. A man everyone in the room was waiting to watch fail, and that she could not bear it, could not bear to let him stand alone in it. So she said the truest and kindest 8 words she had, the same words her mother had left her at the bottom of every well she had ever climbed out of, and they were these: "You're not alone in this. I've got you." 8 words. That was all. You're not alone in this. I've got you. And Han Do-jin, who had been alone in everything for 3 years, who had built a whole cold house precisely so that no one could ever be close enough to say such a thing and mean it, heard those 8 words from a foreign woman he barely knew, and felt, for the first time since a bullet took his legs, that they might actually be true, and the corner of his mouth lifted before his 3 years of ice could stop it. That was the almost smile. That was the crack in the wall. She had not been performing. She had meant it, and she had gone on meaning it, through every day since, until the meaning of it had carried them both to a rainy corner and back. Which is why, on the day it was all finally over, Sung-ho gone, the council loyal, the truth of Emika's sacrifice at last spoken aloud and honored. A place made in the great cold house that was not cold anymore for the memory of a reckless London brother who had bought all of this with his life. Han Do-jin did the thing the whole title of this story promised you. The thing 200 people had once waited a whole wedding to see and never got. He smiled. Fully, freely, all the way. It happened in the kitchen of all places, the warm kitchen that Becky had thawed first, before the study, before the man, before the whole house. Sun-hee was there and Mrs. Bae, and Jong-ho filling the doorway with his enormous grave shoulders, and Becky was standing at the sink humming her terrible tuneless songs, hanging yet another plant no one had asked for, and she turned around with soap on her hands to argue with her husband about something small and ridiculous and daily. And Han Do-jin looked at her, at this impossible woman who had crossed the whole world and stood in the gap twice and loved him for no strategic reason at all, and he smiled at her, wide and unguarded and true, the whole 3 years of ice gone as though it had never been. And the kitchen went utterly silent, because not one person in that house had ever, in all their years of service, seen the boss's face do such a thing. Mrs. Bae, it must be recorded, burst into tears, and pretended fiercely that she had not. Sun-hee dropped a bowl. Jong-ho, the silent giant who had worn the sorrow of an unfinished funeral for 3 years, made a sound no one had heard from him before, a low, rough thing that turned out, against all expectation, to be a laugh. And Becky stood at the sink with soap on her hands and looked at her husband smiling at her, like the sun coming up over the mountains, and understood that the wound she had carried her whole life, that she was only ever wanted for what she could do, and would be discarded the day the use ran out, was, finally, healed. Because Han Do-jin was not smiling at what she could do. He was smiling at her. He wanted her, plainly, permanently, for no reason at all except that she was herself. And that, in the end, was the joy the title promised. Not a grand thing. A woman with soap on her hands and a man who had forgotten how to smile, in a warm kitchen, choosing each other in the ordinary daylight. They did not have a fairy tale, because this was never that kind of story. His legs did not come back, the wheelchair stayed, and they built a whole life at its height, and it turned out a life could be built there as well as anywhere. Better than most, because it was built on the 2 hardest and truest things a life can rest on: a debt honored, and a love chosen with the eyes wide open. They spoke of Emeka often, and without flinching, and made his name a warm thing in that house rather than a wound. Becky sent for a photograph of him from London and hung it in the study, beside the rainy corner, so that the man who had died there and the place he had died were held together in the light where everyone could see them, and no one would ever again pretend not to know. She sent money home and cleared her mother's debt, and bought back nothing of the old life, because she did not want the old life. She had a new one. She had, at last, the one small, safe thing she had crossed the world to find, except it had not turned out small at all. And here is the thing this story wants to leave in your hands, besties, the thing worth carrying out of this hour. The people who break us and the people who save us sometimes wear the very same face, and the same night that takes everything from us can, if we are brave enough to keep climbing, be the exact night that gives everything back. Just later, and in disguise, and never in the shape we would have chosen. Becky's worst night and her best life began on the same rainy corner in Seoul. Grief and joy are not opposites. They are the 2 ends of the same thread, And love is what happens when you are brave enough to hold both at once and refuse to let go of either. Becky Coker threw his body over a stranger in the rain and never knew what it would grow into. He never got to see the kitchen, or the smile, or his sister happy at last, or his own name spoken warmly in a house across the world. But it grew anyway. That is what the bravest, most reckless love always does. It grows in the dark, long after we have stopped being able to watch it, into something none of us could ever have planned. So do the stupid thing and the right thing when they arrive wearing the same coat. Stand in the gap. Say the 8 words to the person who thinks they are alone. You will almost never know what it grows into. Plant it anyway. If this story kept you hooked, there's plenty more waiting for you in my ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories not available on YouTube. Click the link in the description or simply scan the QR code by pausing the video and opening your phone's camera to get instant access in just a few moments. I can't wait for you to discover your next favorite love story. That's our story for today, besties. If Becky and Dojin found their way into your heart, do me one small kindness, subscribe, and come sit with us again tomorrow, because there are so many more of these stories to tell, and none of us should have to sit through them alone. Welcome to your home of Afro-Korean stories, besties. I've got you. Until tomorrow.